Imagine meeting someone who once had the power to completely destroy your peace, someone whose words could ruin your entire day, someone whose approval you desperately wanted, someone whose criticism felt unbearable, someone who made you question your worth, your instincts, and sometimes even your reality. Now imagine meeting that same person years later, but this time something is different. Not them. You. You're no longer the same person they once knew. You're no longer the empath who constantly explained yourself. The empath who gave endless second chances. The empath who carried everyone's emotional burdens. The empath who confused self-sacrifice with love. The empath who stayed too long, tolerated too much, and hoped kindness would eventually be enough. That version of you is gone. And what happens next is something many narcissists never expect. Because one of the greatest misconceptions about healing is that it changes how you feel about other people. In reality, true healing changes how you feel about yourself. And once that happens, everything else begins changing too, including how you respond to the people who once controlled you. This is the story of what happens when a healed empath meets a narcissist again. And if you've ever escaped a toxic relationship, a manipulative friendship, or a controlling family dynamic, you'll recognize pieces of yourself in this journey. Because the reunion rarely unfolds the way people imagine. Most empaths spend months, sometimes years, imagining that moment, the moment they see the narcissist again. At first, they fantasize about revenge, proving themselves, showing how much they've changed, showing how successful they've become, showing how wrong the narcissist was. It's a completely human reaction. After all, narcissistic relationships often leave wounds, not just emotional wounds, identity wounds. The narcissist doesn't simply hurt your feelings. They often reshape how you see yourself. They make you question your strengths, question your value, question your perceptions, question your instincts. And when someone spends enough time doing that, healing becomes about far more than moving on. It becomes about rebuilding trust, rebuilding confidence, rebuilding self-respect, rebuilding the relationship you have with yourself. This process takes time, much longer than most people expect, because healing isn't a straight line. There are setbacks, moments of doubt, moments of grief, moments when you miss people who hurt you, moments when you question whether leaving was the right choice. And perhaps most confusing of all, moments when you miss the version of yourself that existed before the pain. But eventually, something begins happening. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare. The empath starts changing. Not because someone saves them, not because the narcissist apologizes, not because justice arrives, but because they begin learning something they never fully understood before: themselves. For years, many empaths become experts on everyone else. They understand other people's emotions, other people's wounds, other people's needs, other people's motivations, but they rarely understand themselves with the same depth. Their focus is always outward, always giving, always helping, always understanding. Healing reverses that pattern. For the first time, the empath turns inward. They begin asking different questions. What do I need? What do I value? What do I tolerate? What do I deserve? What kind of life do I want? These questions seem simple, but they are revolutionary, because the narcissistic dynamic often trains people to abandon themselves, to prioritize someone else's needs, someone else's emotions, someone else's approval. The healed empath no longer does this, and that's why the reunion becomes so fascinating. Because narcissists often expect familiarity. They expect access. They expect old patterns to remain available. What they don't expect is transformation. Imagine a magician returning to perform a trick on someone who now knows exactly how the illusion works. The performance may look the same, the gestures may look the same, the words may sound the same, but the effect is gone. That's what healing does. It doesn't necessarily change the narcissist. It changes your ability to be affected by them. And that distinction is everything. When the narcissist sees the healed empath again, they often begin with what worked before: charm, confidence, familiarity, sometimes even warmth, not always because they miss you, sometimes because they're checking something, testing something, looking for evidence that the old influence still exists. Can they still trigger guilt? Can they still trigger insecurity? Can they still create emotional confusion? Can they still gain access? The healed empath notices something immediately. The old emotional hooks don't land the way they used to. The comments feel different. The compliments feel different. The criticisms feel different. Not because the narcissist changed, because the empath changed. Years ago, a dismissive remark might have ruined their week. Now it barely captures their attention. Years ago, a cold reaction might have triggered anxiety. Now it simply provides information. Years ago, a manipulative comment might have sparked self-doubt. Now it reveals a pattern. And this is where the narcissist often becomes confused, because they're interacting with someone they recognize physically, but emotionally, the person standing before them is almost a stranger. One of the most surprising things a healed empath experiences during this reunion is clarity. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. For years, they may have viewed the narcissist through a lens of emotional attachment, hope, fear, longing, confusion. Now that lens is gone, and without it, things look remarkably different. The behaviors that once felt powerful now appear predictable. The tactics that once felt confusing now appear obvious. The emotional games that once felt overwhelming now seem transparent. It's almost like watching a movie you've already seen. You know what's coming next. You recognize the pattern before it unfolds. And because of that, the emotional impact is dramatically reduced. This can be shocking, not only for the narcissist, for the empath too, because many survivors secretly fear that seeing the narcissist again will reopen every wound, that they'll fall apart, lose progress, become trapped all over again. But healing often creates the opposite experience. The empath realizes how far they've come, not because they're unaffected, but because they respond differently. And response is where growth becomes visible. A healed empath doesn't need to win every conversation, doesn't need to prove every point, doesn't need to defend every accusation, doesn't need to explain every decision. Years ago, they may have spent hours trying to be understood. Now they understand something far more important. Not everyone is committed to understanding you. Some people are committed to controlling the narrative. And once you recognize the difference, your energy stops flowing into impossible battles. The narcissist often notices this shift before anyone else, because control depends on predictability. The narcissist knows how to navigate guilt, how to navigate people-pleasing, how to navigate insecurity. But a healed empath introduces something much more difficult: unpredictability. Not because they're chaotic, because they're free. And freedom is incredibly difficult to manipulate. The narcissist may attempt old tactics, old triggers, old patterns, only to discover that the emotional doors they once used no longer open. This realization can create frustration, confusion, even disbelief. Because narcissists often assume access is permanent. They assume familiarity guarantees influence. But healing quietly changes the rules. And the most dramatic part of the reunion hasn't even happened yet. Because eventually, the narcissist realizes something that threatens the very foundation of their power. Something they hoped would never happen. The empath no longer needs them, not emotionally, not psychologically, not for validation, not for identity. And once that realization arrives, the dynamic changes in a way neither person can ignore, because the strongest response a healed empath can offer isn't anger, isn't revenge, isn't confrontation. It's something far more unsettling, something that reveals just how complete the healing has become. And that's exactly where the story continues. Because the moment the narcissist realizes the empath no longer needs them, something unusual happens. The balance of power shifts, not because the empath takes control, because they stop surrendering it. For years, the narcissist may have occupied a central place in the empath's emotional world. Their approval mattered. Their opinions mattered. Their reactions mattered. Even their silence mattered. The empath's emotional state often rose and fell according to the narcissist's behavior. But healing changes this completely. The narcissist is no longer the center of the empath's universe. In many cases, they are no longer even a significant part of it. And this realization can be difficult for a narcissist to process, because narcissistic dynamics often depend on emotional significance. The narcissist wants to matter, to influence, to affect, to shape outcomes. When they discover that their emotional reach has dramatically diminished, it creates a problem they cannot easily solve. Imagine spending years learning how to unlock a particular door, then one day arriving to discover the entire building has been replaced. The old keys no longer work. The old methods no longer apply. The old access no longer exists. That's often what this reunion feels like for a narcissist. The empath they once knew is gone. Not physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the healed empath doesn't hate them. Many people assume healing ends with hatred, bitterness, resentment. But genuine healing often produces something entirely different. Indifference, not cruel indifference, peaceful indifference. The narcissist no longer occupies the emotional space they once did. The empath doesn't spend nights replaying conversations, doesn't obsess over being understood, doesn't fantasize about revenge, doesn't need validation. The chapter has ended, and while this may sound simple, it is actually one of the most profound transformations a person can experience. Because narcissistic relationships often create emotional addiction, highs and lows, hope and disappointment, approval and rejection. The nervous system becomes accustomed to instability. Healing breaks that cycle. The empath discovers peace, and once peace becomes familiar, chaos loses much of its appeal. This is why many healed empaths experience something shocking during the reunion. They feel nothing, or at least far less than they expected. The person who once dominated their thoughts now feels strangely ordinary. The person who once seemed powerful now appears human, flawed, predictable, limited. The illusion fades, and when illusions disappear, reality takes their place. The empath begins seeing the narcissist not as a giant figure looming over their life, but as an individual operating from their own fears, insecurities, and limitations. This perspective is incredibly liberating, because fear often depends on exaggeration. The narcissist seemed larger than life because they occupied so much mental space. Once that space is reclaimed, their influence shrinks, not because they became smaller, because the empath became larger. Larger in confidence, larger in awareness, larger in self-respect, larger in emotional maturity. One of the most fascinating parts of this reunion is how differently both people interpret what's happening. The empath sees closure. The narcissist often sees challenge. The empath sees growth. The narcissist often sees loss of influence. The empath sees a completed lesson. The narcissist sees a changed dynamic. And because narcissists frequently struggle with losing control, they may respond in unexpected ways. Some become unusually charming, suddenly friendly, suddenly interested, suddenly supportive, not always because they've changed, sometimes because they're attempting to reconnect with old patterns. Other narcissists become critical, dismissive, passive-aggressive, attempting to provoke emotional reactions, attempting to recreate familiar dynamics, attempting to find the old version of the empath hidden somewhere beneath the healing. But the healed empath notices something important. The reactions no longer dictate their behavior. Years ago, they may have felt compelled to respond, defend, explain, convince. Now they simply observe. Observation is one of the greatest signs of healing, because observation creates distance, and distance creates freedom. The empath no longer experiences every interaction as a personal referendum on their worth. They understand something they didn't understand before. Other people's behavior often reveals far more about them than it does about you. This insight changes everything. A criticism becomes information. A manipulation attempt becomes information. A guilt trip becomes information. Instead of absorbing these behaviors, the healed empath evaluates them, and evaluation prevents emotional capture. Perhaps the most unsettling thing for a narcissist is that the healed empath no longer seeks permission. Not permission to be happy, not permission to grow, not permission to succeed, not permission to leave, not permission to exist as they truly are. This independence is powerful, because narcissistic dynamics often depend on dependence, emotional dependence, psychological dependence, validation dependence. Once those dependencies disappear, the relationship changes fundamentally. The narcissist can no longer offer what the empath once desperately sought, and because of that, their leverage disappears. This is why many healed empaths describe the reunion as strangely anticlimactic. They expect fireworks, closure speeches, dramatic confrontations. Instead, they experience clarity, the realization that healing happened long before the meeting itself. The reunion simply reveals it, like a final exam revealing how much you've already learned. The true healing occurred during the months and years leading up to that moment. Every boundary, every difficult decision, every act of self-respect, every moment of choosing peace over chaos, every time they trusted themselves instead of seeking external validation. The reunion merely confirms the transformation. And perhaps the greatest confirmation comes from what doesn't happen. The empath doesn't abandon themselves, doesn't shrink, doesn't people please, doesn't betray their values, doesn't lose their voice. Years ago, the narcissist may have had access to those vulnerabilities. Now those vulnerabilities have been replaced by something stronger, self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. Because a person who trusts themselves is incredibly difficult to manipulate. They still make mistakes, still learn, still grow, but they no longer automatically surrender their perspective. They no longer assume someone else's version of reality is more valid than their own. This confidence is quiet, not arrogant, not aggressive, simply steady. And steady confidence often unsettles narcissists more than open resistance ever could. Why? Because resistance still acknowledges their influence. Steady confidence does not. It simply moves forward. One of the final lessons the healed empath learns is that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You can release resentment without reopening access. You can let go of anger without rebuilding the relationship. You can wish someone well from a distance. This understanding frees the empath from a false choice. They don't have to hate the narcissist, and they don't have to return to the old dynamic. They can simply move on. And moving on is often the most powerful statement of all. Not because it punishes the narcissist, because it liberates the empath. In the end, what happens when a healed empath meets a narcissist again is not what most people expect. There is no dramatic victory, no emotional showdown, no grand finale. Instead, there is something much more meaningful. Proof. Proof that healing is real. Proof that growth is possible. Proof that self-respect can be rebuilt. Proof that peace can return. The narcissist sees someone they once influenced. The empath sees someone who no longer defines them. And within that difference lies the entire story. Because the greatest sign of healing is not that you stop remembering what happened. It's that what happened no longer controls who you become. The healed empath understands this, and that's why the reunion feels so different than expected. The narcissist arrives looking for the person they once knew, but that person no longer exists. In their place stands someone stronger, wiser, calmer, more self-aware. Someone who no longer needs approval to feel worthy. Someone who no longer mistakes sacrifice for love. Someone who finally understands their own value. And that realization is something no narcissist can take away. because it was never given by them in the first place. It was built, earned, protected, and ultimately reclaimed by the empath themselves. And that is why, when a healed empath meets a narcissist again, the most important thing that happens is not what the narcissist does. It's what the empath no longer does. They no longer abandon themselves. And from that moment forward, everything changes.